I'm going to tell you something that I've kept to myself for the better part of a decade. Not because I'm afraid people won't believe me. I stopped caring about that a long time ago. I'm telling it now because the statute of limitations on some things expires, and because I think people need to know that they're still out there and that they're not the monsters we assume they are. They're not what the stories make them out to be. They're not howling demons or mindless killers. They're something else entirely, something that deserves understanding. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name's Marcus Reeves. I'm 47 years old, based out of Joseph, Oregon, and I bow hunt the Wallowa Mountains every fall, have for going on 23 years. The Wallowas are in northeast Oregon, high country, Eagle Cap Wilderness and the Lakes Basin, rough terrain, steep ravines, old-growth larch and fir that hasn't been logged in decades. You've got Wallowa Lake at the bottom, the town of Joseph right there on the water, population maybe 1,500, the kind of place where people know each other and don't ask too many questions. It's a town built on logging and ranching history, on people who worked hard and didn't talk much about what they did. My grandfather logged these mountains in the 1950s. My father hunted them in the 1970s and 1980s. I hunt them now, and I expect my nephew will hunt them someday too, if the country holds and the game stays. It's a family thing, a generational thing, this relationship with the Wallowas. Then you go up from there into country that gets progressively wilder the higher you climb. By the time you're at 9,000 feet, you're in alpine meadow with glacial lakes and peaks that still have snow in July. The air is so thin that your first few days up there are spent just breathing harder than usual. The light is different, too. The clarity at that elevation makes everything look closer than it is. Mountains you think are 2 miles away are actually 5. The sky takes up half your vision because there's nothing blocking it. On clear days, you can see the Blue Mountains to the east, the high desert rolling out beyond them toward Idaho. You can see the Cascades to the west when the light is right. You're standing in the middle of something vast and ancient, something that's been here since before humans had a name for mountains. I hunt the lower elevations mostly, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, where the mule deer winter and the elk spend the later part of the season moving through the conifer stands. That's where the animals congregate when the weather starts turning. I'm not a trophy hunter. I'm after meat, freezer meat. The kind of hunting that takes patience and time, and a willingness to sit in one place for hours without moving. I spend my whole year thinking about September and October. I work in construction in Joseph during the off-season, building additions, doing remodels, the kind of work that pays decent if you're good at it and keeps you moving during the months when hunting isn't happening. But my real life is up there in the mountains. Up there is where I'm actually myself. The guy who frames houses and hangs doors, that's not the real me. That's the work version, the version that pays the bills. The real Marcus is the one who knows where the deer bed down in September and how the wind moves through the lake's basin at different times of day. I hunt alone. Always have. There's something about being out there by yourself, moving through the forest with a bow, that requires a different kind of attention than hunting with a partner. You're not talking, not comparing notes, not breaking the silence with conversation. You're just listening. Every sound becomes information. The squirrel chittering 300 yards up the ravine means nothing is moving in that direction. The way the wind shifts through the fir tells you where it's coming from and whether thermals are going to work in your favor. The change in bird activity that happens when something large moves through their territory, that's the most valuable sign of all. You learn to read the woods the way other people read a book, and the woods teach you the difference between what's supposed to be there and what isn't. They teach you the difference between normal and wrong. After 23 years, I can walk into a forest and within an hour know if there's been recent predator activity, if the deer are bedded down close or if they're high, if something has spooked the whole area recently. The woods become a language, and you become fluent in it. I've been hunting since I was 8 years old. My father took me out to kill my first rabbit with a .22 rifle and a single bullet in the chamber. He believed in starting small, in understanding what it meant to take a life, in learning respect for the animal before you ever pulled a trigger on anything larger. I missed and the rabbit ran, and I spent the rest of that day feeling like I'd failed at something important, something irreplaceable. I remember sitting on a log watching the rabbit disappear into the brush, and my father sitting next to me without saying anything for maybe 10 minutes. Then he said, "You'll get another chance. The mountains have plenty of rabbits. What matters is that you learn something from this." That became the philosophy that governed everything I did in the wilderness. After that, learn. Pay attention. Understand that every action has a consequence. I learned to shoot better after that first failure. I learned to pay attention to wind and light and the 1,000 small details that make the difference between a successful hunt and going home empty. I learned to understand that every action has a consequence and that you don't get to take a shot back. By the time I was a teenager, I was hunting elk and deer in the Wallowas with more experience than guys twice my age. By the time I got to adulthood, hunting wasn't just what I did. It was who I was. The rifle, the bow, the knowledge of animals and country, the patience that hunting requires. Those things are written into my bones. So when I tell you what happened to me in that ravine, I want you to understand that I'm not a person who panics. But before I get to the ravine, I need to tell you about my father and what he told me when I was 15 years old. My father hunted the Wallowas in the 1970s and early 1980s, before I was born. He was a quiet man, the kind of man who believed actions spoke louder than words. He didn't talk much about his hunts, and when he did, he stuck to facts. Which elk he'd killed, which years were good for deer, where the water sources dried up in late summer. But there was one story he told me only once and only when he'd had a few drinks, which was rare for him. I was 15. We were sitting by the fire at a hunting cabin up near Mirror Lake, the same area where I found the Bigfoot decades later. It was September, and the air had that edge to it that meant fall was coming hard. My father had been quiet all evening, staring into the fire, and I'd asked him about a story I'd overheard him telling another hunter years before. Something about seeing something in the high country that he wouldn't explain. He looked at me for a long time, without answering. The fire crackled. The night was so quiet you could hear the creek running down the ravine, maybe a quarter-mile away. Then he said, "Marcus, there are things in these mountains that don't have names. Not because we haven't discovered them, because we've decided not to." I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I asked him what he meant. He took a long drink of whiskey and set the glass down carefully on a rock. "When I was your age, maybe a little older, I saw something up here. Something big, something that moved like nothing else I'd ever seen. At first, I wanted to tell people. I wanted to know what it was, if others had seen it, if it was real or if I'd imagined it. But then I realized something." He paused, and I watched the firelight play across his weathered face. I realized that if I told people, they'd hunt it. They'd try to prove it existed. They'd turn it into a thing to be studied and documented, and ultimately destroyed. And once I understood that, I knew I couldn't say anything. Not to friends, not to wildlife services, not to anyone. Some things need to stay unknown. I pressed him for more details. What did it look like? How big was it? Where exactly had he seen it? He shook his head at each question. "The less you know, the better," he said. "Knowledge like that is a burden. It sits on your chest every night when you're trying to sleep. It makes you question reality. It makes you wonder if you're crazy. I'm telling you this much. only so that if you ever see something like that, you'll understand what you need to do. You keep it secret. You protect it by not talking about it. That's the only way it survives. I didn't understand it then, not really. I was 15, and I wanted adventure and mystery and proof of impossible things. But I understood it perfectly the night I found the Bigfoot in that ravine. I understood that my father had seen one too, decades before, and had carried that knowledge alone for all those years. I understood that by choosing to help the creature instead of documenting it, instead of reporting it to anyone who might harm it, I was following a path my father had set for me without even knowing it. I was honoring a decision he'd made silently, a choice he'd never directly explained, but had somehow transmitted to me anyway. So when I tell you what happened to me in that ravine, I want you to understand that I'm not a person who panics. I'm not a person who gets confused about what animals look like or behave like. I'm not a person who sees patterns in shadows or hears voices in the wind. I'm a person who has spent more than 4 decades reading animals and country. I know the difference between what I know and what I don't know. And I know when I'm looking at something that doesn't fit any of the categories I have. I know when the world has shifted and the rules have changed. The hunt I'm about to tell you about started on a Wednesday in late September. It was also the 23rd anniversary of my father's death. I hadn't planned it that way, but September 28th had always been the weekend I took off for hunting season, and that year it fell exactly 23 years after he'd passed. He died in his sleep at 62, which seems young to me now that I'm approaching that age myself. Heart attack, no warning. He was out in the shop working on something, a piece of equipment he was trying to fix, and his heart just stopped. My mother found him there, tools scattered around him, a half-finished project that never did get completed. I think about that sometimes, about how my father died before he'd told me the full story of what he'd seen in the Wallowas. He'd given me the philosophy, keep the secret, protect the creature. But he'd never told me specifics. Sometimes I wonder if that was intentional, if he was worried that too much knowledge would drive me to do something he wouldn't want me to do. Find it, hunt it, prove it. Or maybe he just wasn't ready to talk about it, and then he ran out of time. That Wednesday morning, driving up to the trailhead, I felt his presence in a way I hadn't in years. The road through the mountains, the turnoff toward Joseph, the familiar smell of the truck's cab and the worn leather of the steering wheel. All of it connected me to the years he'd spent hunting these same mountains. I'd inherited more than just his name and his jaw and his height. I'd inherited his knowledge and his silence. And I was driving toward that silence, toward the place where he'd encountered something impossible and chosen to never speak about it. The hunt. I'm about to tell you about the kind of September where the nights are dropping into the 20s and the days are crisp and clear. I had the time off work. I'd planned a full 7-day trip into the lake's basin, deep country where most hunters don't go because it's too far for a casual weekend trip. That's a 6-mile hike from the trailhead up past Mirror Lake, then another few miles of cross-country hiking into the high lakes. Takes most people 2 days to get up there. I do it in one long push, usually start at first light and get to camp by dark. My legs are good for that kind of movement. My lungs are good for it. My knees held up better before I turned 40, but they still work fine at elevation. I've done this hike probably 30 times over the years, and I know every mile marker, every water source, every good camp spot. I could do it in the dark if I had to, though I prefer daylight. The weather was good that week. The forecast called for clear skies for at least the first week, maybe longer. In late September, that means cold nights and warm days. It means the first snow is probably 2 weeks away. It means the elk are starting to move, responding to the pressure of fall, preparing for the rut that's coming. It means the deer are getting serious about preparing for winter, eating harder, putting on weight, moving deliberately through their established patterns. The turnaround is happening. The season is tipping from summer to fall, and everything that's alive in the mountains knows it and adjusts. I packed my usual setup: backpack, bow, arrows, sleeping bag rated for below freezing, the minimal camp gear I need. I don't bring a tent. I sleep under a tarp if weather requires it, otherwise just the stars. Lighter, cleaner, and I like waking up to the sound of whatever's moving through the forest at night. That sound is different from daytime sound. Nocturnal animals move differently than daytime animals. The rhythm is different. The purpose is different. I like listening to it, trying to place it, trying to understand what's out there sharing the mountain with me. I'd prepared for this trip the way I always did. The truck was serviced, the oil changed, the tires at the right pressure. I'd gone through my gear twice, checking each item, making sure nothing was damaged or worn. My bow had been at the range a dozen times that summer, and I'd been making regular shots at 100 yards. I was ready. Or at least I thought I was ready, though I don't think anyone can actually be ready for what I was about to encounter. The drive from Joseph takes about 40 minutes if you're not pushing it. I was pushing it. There's a gas station just outside town where I always stop, and I stopped there that morning. The kid behind the counter, probably 16 or 17, knew me. I'd been coming there for 15 years, every September, and he'd probably been working there for half that time. He asked me the same thing he always asked: heading up? I said I was. He said, "You going to get one this year?" I told him maybe, probably not. That's what I always told him. The hunt isn't really about the kill, though that's what most people don't understand. It's about being up there, in the country, in the mountains where nothing cares about your problems or your life in town. I bought coffee, black, no sugar. I'd picked up a breakfast sandwich somewhere between Joseph and the station, and I ate that while I drove. The mountains rose up in front of me as I got closer to the trailhead. The Wallowas were clear that day, no clouds, no haze. They looked like they were maybe 5 miles away instead of the actual 20 or 30. That's what the high desert air does at certain times of year. It erases distance. At the trailhead parking lot, there were maybe 6 other vehicles. None of them belonged to people I knew. A few groups of hikers were getting their gear sorted as I arrived. Young people, mostly, with expensive hiking boots and new backpacks still stiff from the store. I didn't talk to them. I parked, got my pack and my bow from the back of the truck, and started walking. The trail was crowded that time of year. Late September brings the hikers who want to see the lakes in their clearest water, the photographers after the light that only happens that time of year, the casual people looking for a day trip up to Mirror Lake to see the reflection of the mountain in the still water. I counted more than 20 people on the trail the first day, which by wilderness standards is a crowd. Families with kids, older couples moving slowly, young hikers with expensive gear that looked like it had never been used. I heard one group talking about how they were going to get photos for Instagram, how they'd hiked in from the parking lot and planned to be out by sunset. There's something about that that makes me sad. These mountains have existed for millions of years, and now people come to them for photos, to post online. I don't judge them for it. Different people find value in different ways. But once you turn off the main trail and head into the unmarked country, the crowds drop off fast. By the time I was 3 miles cross-country from the standard route, I hadn't seen another human in 2 hours. The trail I was on doesn't appear on most maps. It's marked by cairns if you know what to look for, and by decades of boot traffic creating a worn line through the grass and stones. If you don't know what to look for, you can walk right past it and never know it was there. I've guided that trail from memory more times than I can count. My feet know the way before my brain does. That's the Wallowas. You don't have to go far to find country where you're the only person for miles. I found my spot on Friday afternoon. It was a small alpine meadow, maybe 200 yards across, with a ridge on 3 sides and a natural drainage on the 4th that led down into heavy timber. The kind of setup that concentrates deer movement. They use the ridges to stay alert, watching for predators from the high ground. They bed down in the timber during the day, where the thick canopy keeps them hidden and the cooler temperature helps them lose the heat they generate during the night's feeding. They move through the meadow at dusk when the light is fading and they're less vulnerable to being spotted by hunters or larger predators. It's a pattern as old as the mountains. I spent Friday evening glassing, just lying on the ridge with my binoculars watching the meadow and the tree line. The binoculars are top-quality glass, not cheap tourist gear. I can see individual pine needles at 100 yards if I need to. I can see the texture of bark from 300 yards. I can see a buck's antlers from 400 yards and count the points. I saw 3 mule deer does, a small buck that probably weighed 110, 115 pounds. Some mountain goats way up high on the talus, the kind of rocky slopes where nothing else can go, nothing I wanted to take. I was in no rush. I had 4 more days to find the right animal, to make the right stalk, to earn the kill. That's the hunt. That's why I come back year after year. The hunt is the thing, not the trophy. It's the process, the quiet mornings, the knowledge that you're moving through the world in a way that's honest. You're a predator looking for prey. There's no artifice in it, no pretense, just you and the animal and the mountain. Friday night, I sat under my tarp watching the stars come out, and I felt something I always feel at that elevation, and I want to be clear about what that feeling is. It's not happiness, exactly, though there's happiness in it. It's not peace, though it's closer to that. It's a sense of coming home to a place that doesn't know you exist. The mountain doesn't care about Marcus Reeves. It doesn't care about my failed marriage or my job or the problems I've left behind in Joseph. The mountain just is, and being in a place that doesn't need you, that doesn't care about you, there's a kind of freedom in that. I lay there for hours watching the stars. The temperature was dropping into the 20s, and my breath was visible when I looked down at my hands. I could hear the creek running down the ravine, that constant sound of water moving downhill. I could hear wind in the fir trees, high up in the canopy, so high I couldn't see the movement. I could hear nothing at all, and everything all at once. The sounds of the mountain at night are complex. They're not silence. Silence would be easier, in a way. Silence you could fill with your own thoughts. But these sounds, they fill the darkness. They occupy the space around you. I thought about my father that night, which I often do when I'm up here alone. I thought about what he'd seen, what knowledge he'd carried, the weight of it. I wondered if he'd felt this same rightness when he was in the mountains, this sense that here, in this place, the normal rules of the world didn't apply. I wondered if that's why he'd kept the secret, not just out of protection for the creature, but because sharing it would have broken the spell. It would have brought the normal world into the sacred space where impossible things happened. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A sound like something moving through the forest, far enough away that I couldn't tell exactly what it was. It could have been an elk, could have been a bear, could have been the wind pushing a dead branch against a living tree. I lay there for a while listening, but the sound didn't come again. I went back to trying to sleep, though sleep was a long time coming. That night was the last peaceful night I'd have in the Wallowas for a very long time. I didn't know that then. I was just lying under my tarp, listening to the mountain, feeling the cold seep into my bones, thinking about my father and his secrets. If I'd known what was coming, I don't know if I would have stayed. Probably I would have. Probably some part of me was already tuned to a frequency I didn't yet understand, listening for something I didn't yet know existed. Friday night, I sat under my tarp, that altitude, in that country. I felt right. I felt like this was where I was supposed to be. Like all the noise of regular life, the construction jobs, the rent, the complications of living in towns and around people, all of that fell away, and I was back to who I actually was. An animal in the wilderness, trying to survive, trying to find food, trying to understand the world around me. That's the real me. The other version, the guy who pays bills and has small talk with his neighbors, that's a disguise. This is the truth. I lay there under that tarp, listening to the wind move through the fir trees, listening to the sound of the creek running down the ravine in the distance, and I felt like I'd finally come home after months of being away. This is where I belong. This is where I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. Saturday morning, I was up before light. I was on my ridge by 4:30, waiting for the first color to come into the sky. The stars were fading. The moon was mostly set. The air was that temperature where you can see your breath and your fingers start getting numb, even with gloves on, the kind of cold that tells you fall is turning to winter, that the window for good hunting is closing. That's when I saw the track.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
It was on the far side of the meadow where a small stream comes out of the forest, and it caught my eye because it was wrong for the country. Too big, for one thing, too deliberate. The stream had cut a wet sandbar where the water spread out before pooling up in a small basin, and there was a print in that sand that was 18 inches long, maybe 6 inches across at the widest point. 5 toes. I know what a bear track looks like. I've seen hundreds of them over 23 years. The big toe on a bear print is on the outside of the foot, and the prints are almost as wide as they are long. The claw marks are distinct. The pad structure is specific to what a bear is. This print had the big toe in the middle or slightly inboard, and the proportions suggested something walking on 2 legs. I've seen thousands of animal tracks in the Wallowas. I know what a bear leaves. I know what a human leaves in a hiking boot, the way the pressure distributes when someone walks, the way the toes splay. This was neither. This was something else, something I didn't have a category for. I stood there for a long time, looking at that track. I must have stared at it for 5 or 10 minutes without moving. My mind was cycling through possibilities, rejecting each one, cycling again. The track was real. The sand around it was undisturbed except for the footprints leading to it and away from it. The creature had come down the ridge, crossed the meadow, descended to the stream, stepped into the sandbar, drank, and then departed. One clear route, one clear pattern, one clear impossibility. The more I looked at it, the more wrong it was. A bear's track would have claw marks extending maybe an inch beyond the toes. This print had no claw marks at all. A bear's track would be wider, more splayed. This was narrow at the heel, concentrated at the toes, suggesting weight distributed like a human's weight would be distributed. But the size. My boot is 12¼ inches long. This print was 18 inches, nearly 50% longer, and the depth. When I pressed my boot into the sand, it sank maybe an inch. This print was 2 inches deep, maybe more, suggesting weight concentrated on a smaller surface area. Massive weight. Concentrated force. I walked the length of the sandbar, following the prints. They were spaced 4½ feet apart. I measured with my own steps. A human at a run can manage that. A human at a walk cannot. This creature had been walking, not running, and covering ground like nothing I'd ever encountered. The stride suggested power and speed and an unfamiliar gait. something between a human run and an animal's pace. I felt my hands starting to shake, not from cold, from something else, from the moment when belief starts to shift, when the world you thought you understood starts to fracture. I've read stories about this, about people who claim to have seen things that shouldn't exist, and I've always wondered if they were lying or crazy or mistaken. Now I was standing in front of evidence of something that couldn't be explained, something that didn't fit any category I had, and I was starting to understand the weight of that moment. I didn't tell anyone about the track, not that day. I just went back to my camp and tried to focus on hunting. But my concentration was gone. I kept thinking about the footprints. I kept thinking about what creature could make them. I kept thinking about my father and what he'd seen, and whether this was connected somehow, whether this was a thing he'd encountered decades ago, a survivor from his era. The track sat in my mind all day like a stone in a shoe, present and irritating and impossible to ignore. I stood there for a long time, looking at that track. My first thought was elk, some kind of weird angle making the print look stranger than it was. Elk have large feet, and they can leave surprising marks in the right substrate. But I knew better. I knew what I was looking at, and I also knew that what I was looking at was something I had no frame of reference for beyond stories I'd heard around campfires and dismissed as hunters' tales, and too much whiskey. Stories my father had told me when I was young about seeing something big in the high country. Stories he never elaborated on, stories he seemed to regret bringing up. I remember asking him about one story when I was maybe 15. He'd been drinking, which was unusual for him. He'd mentioned seeing something that didn't have a name. I asked him what it was. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Some things don't have names because people don't want them to." That was all he ever said about it, but it stuck with me. Those words stayed with me. I looked around the meadow. The grass was disturbed in a line from the forest edge to the stream, like something had walked from the trees down to get water. The disturbance was subtle, not obvious, but once I saw the track, the pattern became clear. Something had come down to drink, probably at dusk or after dark when it felt safe, and it was large enough that its passage had left a trace even in the tough alpine grass that can spring back and hide most passage. The disturbance was recent. The grass was still bent from where something had walked through it. I could see where the creature had paused at the stream's edge, where it had settled down to drink, the indentation of its weight in the soft earth. This wasn't old sign. This was recent. This was maybe 12 hours old, maybe less. I didn't think much about it on Saturday. Tracks meant movement. Movement meant the animal was probably gone. I settled in on my ridge and I hunted. The day was clear and cold. The kind of September day in the Wallowas where the light is sharp and the air has that crystalline quality that makes distant things look close, makes the mountains look like you could reach out and touch them. I glassed the meadow every hour. I saw the same does in the afternoon, maybe 300 yards away, moving through the tree line at the far edge. Saw the small buck I'd glassed on Friday, moving deliberately, his body tense, aware of something. Nothing that was the right animal, nothing that was the right moment. I made a small fire just before dark, boiled water for coffee, ate cold elk meat from my cooler, and some trail mix. Then I settled under my tarp as the stars came out and the temperature dropped. The night was so clear, you could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. I lay there watching the sky, and I thought about how small I was, how insignificant. The stars had been there for billions of years before humans existed and would be there for billions of years after humanity was gone. Humans had been hunting these mountains for maybe 10,000 years, and in all that time, in all those thousands of years of human presence in the Wallowas, most humans had never seen the thing I'd just seen. Or maybe many had seen it, and most had kept quiet about it, joining my father in the silent understanding that some things need to stay secret. The mountains had their own way of keeping secrets. They were better at it than humans would ever be. Humans had been hunting these mountains for maybe 10,000 years, and in that time most of us had never seen the thing I'd just seen. Or maybe they had, and had kept quiet about it, joining my father in the silent understanding that some things need to stay secret. I thought about going home. I thought about getting in my truck and driving back to Joseph and trying to forget that any of this had happened. I thought about that for a long time. But I knew I couldn't forget it. I could pretend to forget it. I could tell myself that it was a hallucination or a trick of the light. But somewhere deep inside, I would always know the truth. I would always carry the knowledge that the world contained things that weren't supposed to exist. The night was so clear, you could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. That's the thing about high country in September. The air is so thin and so clean that the sky becomes almost oppressive in how much of it you can see. Stars that you never see at lower elevations. The texture of the galactic core visible as something more than an abstraction. I lay there for hours, just looking up, thinking about nothing, letting the mountain do its thing. Sunday morning I woke to the sound of something moving in the forest above me. Not casual movement, deliberate, heavy. The sound of a large animal moving through the fir trees without particular concern for stealth. I lay there listening, keeping my eyes closed, trying to place the sound without being obvious that I was awake. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed. It was angling toward the meadow. I got up quietly and moved to where I had a sight line through the trees, and I saw it. Or at least I saw something, a shape, dark, massive, moving between the fir trees about 200 yards upslope. It was moving fast for something so large, and it was moving on two legs. I couldn't see detail from that distance, just the general profile. Broad shoulders, long arms, a head that seemed small relative to the body size, which was the opposite of everything I knew about the proportions of large animals. Large animals have large heads. This thing had a head that was all wrong for the body it was attached to. It crossed a small clearing between the trees, and I caught maybe 3 seconds of clear profile before it angled back into the heavier timber. Then it was gone. But those 3 seconds changed everything. I sat there for a while trying to process what I'd just seen. And I want you to understand that this wasn't like the track. The track was evidence. The track was something I could examine and measure and rationalize. But seeing the creature move, seeing it with my own eyes, seeing the way it traveled through the forest with that distinctive gait, that was something else entirely. That was experiential knowledge. That was the difference between reading about impossible things and standing in front of one. My mind was cycling through possibilities. Each one was more impossible than the last. A man? No man moved like that. A bear? No bear had those proportions. A hoax? Who would construct such an elaborate hoax in the middle of the wilderness where no one would see it? And the passage through the forest had been real. I'd heard it. I'd seen the disturbance it caused. This wasn't a theory or a possibility. This was something that had weight and mass and physical reality. I sat there for a while trying to process what I'd just seen. The rational part of my brain cycled through options. A man? Unlikely. There were no trails nearby, no reason for a person to be moving that fast through that country at that hour. The terrain was too rough, too exposed. The slope was steep enough that a person moving that fast would be taking serious risks. A large animal. The shape didn't match anything I knew. Bears don't run on 2 legs like that, not for distance. I've seen bears stand up on their hind legs, but that's momentary, unstable. This thing was moving with purpose on 2 legs, arms pumping at its sides, covering ground with a rhythm that suggested strength and control. Elk don't move that way either. Elk are 4-legged animals, and they stay 4-legged when they run. Neither do mountain goats or bighorn or any other animal I could name. I had a moment of genuine vertigo. The feeling you get when your brain encounters information that doesn't have a slot. All my mental categories were organized and labeled, and this thing didn't fit anywhere. I could feel my heart rate picking up. I could feel the adrenaline starting. I checked my rifle. I had a .308 Winchester in my pack, broken down in a protective case, but it took me less than a minute to assemble it. I don't hunt with it. I carry it for bears and situations that call for more power than a bow. This seemed like it might qualify. For the next 4 hours, I stayed alert. I moved position every 30 minutes, staying in areas with good visibility and good cover. The meadow stayed quiet. The birds came back after the creatures passing. The morning light moved across the ridges and the wind picked up the way it does when the sun gets higher. Whatever I'd seen was either gone or had moved far enough away that I didn't hear it. By mid-morning, I was starting to second-guess what I'd seen. Distance does things to the eye. Light does things to the mind. A bear standing up and moving awkwardly could look bipedal from the right angle. An elk's long stride could look like something else to someone expecting something else. The brain fills in gaps. The brain sees what it wants to see. I knew that. I knew how easily perception could be distorted. And yet something in me knew I'd seen what I'd seen. But then I saw the second track. It was in the soft ground at the edge of the meadow where water had pooled from the stream, 20 inches long this time, bigger than the first one, and the toes were splayed wide, like the creature had been walking fast, putting pressure down on the sides of the foot for traction. There was dried blood in the track, just a small amount, smeared along the inside edge, but it was definitely blood. It was a dark red color that you get from dried blood that's been exposed to air for a while. Not fresh, but not old either. The track was maybe 4 hours old, fresh enough that the edges were still clean, old enough that the blood had dried. I put my boot next to it. My foot is a size 13. My boot length is 12¼ inches. The track was half again as long as my boot. The width was roughly 2.5 times the width of my boot. At the heel, the width was narrow, like something walking on 2 legs, with the weight distributed on the forefoot. The stride was long. I paced out the distance between prints where they were visible in the soft ground. 4.5 feet. That was the distance between footfalls. For a creature that size to cover that distance on one stride suggested speed, strength, power beyond anything I'd seen in the wild. A human running can manage 4 feet between steps if they're moving hard. This creature was walking, just walking and covering ground that should have required running. I didn't hunt that day. I moved my camp back away from the open meadow, into the trees where I could see without being seen. I built my tarp shelter in a small stand of larch trees, with good sight lines and good cover. I positioned it so I could observe the meadow and the creek and the forest approaches without being obvious from any direction. I moved quietly. Every motion was deliberate. I was genuinely unsure what I was dealing with. And unease has a way of sharpening your focus. That night I didn't sleep well. I dozed for maybe 40 minutes around midnight. Then I was up and alert the rest of the night. I heard movement twice. Once around 3 in the morning, something moving through the meadow, large enough that I could hear the footfalls on the grass, the sound of something heavy walking. Once around 4:30, sounds coming from higher up the ridge, like the creature was pacing the ridgeline, moving back and forth as if it was searching for something or someone. The temperature dropped as the night wore on. By 4 in the morning it was in the low 20s, and my breath was visible, and the stars were so clear it hurt to look at them. Monday morning I made a decision. I was going to break camp and head down the trail. Whatever was up there, it was large enough and deliberate enough that I didn't want to be alone with it for 4 more days. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and I didn't have the equipment or the experience to deal with it. I started packing my gear. It was still dark, maybe an hour before first light. I was moving quietly, trying to minimize noise. I had my pack mostly sorted when I heard it. It was a sound like nothing I'd heard before. A vocalization, low and deep, coming from down in the timber below my camp. It wasn't an animal sound exactly, but it was clearly alive. It was sustained for maybe 3 seconds, and then it cut off abruptly. I froze. My hand was on my rifle, and for a moment, maybe 5 seconds, I seriously considered just getting on the trail and not stopping until I reached the truck. I considered packing everything I had into my backpack and leaving the tarp and some supplies behind, if it meant moving faster. I considered hiking down in daylight even though I'd be moving through rough country with low visibility. I considered doing anything except going toward the sound that had just pierced the night. Then I heard the second sound, and the moment of decision crystallized into action and not stopping until I reached the truck. I considered leaving gear behind if it meant moving faster. I considered moving in daylight when I could see better, when the thing couldn't use darkness as cover. Then I heard the second sound. It was pain. I'm telling you, with absolute certainty, it was pain, not the pain of something being killed by a predator. That's a shriek, a final panic, the sound of an animal's life ending. This was different. This was a long, low groan that went on for almost 10 seconds and communicated something close to agony. The kind of sound that a living creature makes when it's trying to keep itself from screaming. It came from maybe 300 yards, down slope, in the heavy timber. And then it cut off. And everything went quiet. The forest held its silence the way it does when something large is suffering. I sat there in the dark, with my pack half assembled and my rifle in my hands, and I made a decision that I still don't fully understand. I left my pack. I took my rifle and my backpack, first aid kit, and a headlamp, and I went down slope toward the sound. I've asked myself 1,000 times why I did that, why I didn't just get out, why I didn't hike down in daylight when I could see. The only answer I have is that some part of me, some deep part that's older than fear, heard that sound and recognized it for what it was, a creature in distress, a living thing that was suffering, and that part of me couldn't turn away. The forest down from my camp was thick, larch and fir, no undergrowth, just a thick mat of needles and the occasional deadfall log. I moved slowly, keeping the rifle ready, keeping the headlamp off and using the starlight and my night vision to navigate. My eyes took a few minutes to adjust to the dark, but once they did, I could see reasonably well. The stars and the moon that was approaching full were enough to move by. It took me maybe 20 minutes to cover 300 yards. I was listening hard the whole way, waiting for another sound, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself again. My heart rate was elevated. I was ready for something to come at me. I was ready for attack. The descent from my camp to the ravine took me through forest so thick it felt like I was moving through a solid thing. The fir trees crowded in on both sides, and the deadfall was everywhere, old logs rotting into the forest floor, becoming soil, feeding new trees. I had to pick my way carefully. The starlight didn't penetrate this deep, and I was relying more on memory of the terrain and the sound of the creek to guide me than on vision. My hands were on the rifle, finger near the trigger guard, but not on the trigger. I was moving slow enough that I wouldn't make mistakes, fast enough that I wasn't lingering. The ravine got deeper as I descended. The slope steepened. The air got colder and damper, the way air does when it's been trapped in a narrow space between rock walls. I could smell the creek now, the mineral smell of water running over stone. And underneath that, something else, something animal, something that didn't belong to this place, or at least something that didn't belong in the normal scheme of forest animals. I stopped maybe 50 yards above the ravine and listened. Nothing. No sound of movement, no sound of breathing, no sound at all except the creek and the wind high in the canopy. I moved forward again, trying to make my footsteps light on the needle carpet, trying to be quiet enough that nothing down there would know I was coming, but quietly or not, I was coming. Some part of me was committed to descending into that ravine. Some part of me had already decided what I would do. The trees opened up suddenly, and I found myself on the edge of a drop-off that fell away into darkness. Below me, I could hear the creek more clearly, running over rocks, the sound of water that had dropped a significant distance. I could smell it too, that mineral-clean smell of cold water in a mountain stream. The ravine was narrow, maybe 30 feet across at this point, with steep rock walls on both sides. The creek ran down the middle, and on the far bank, where the rock gave way to dirt and gravel, I saw a shape. I found it in a small ravine where the land dropped off steeply, and a small creek ran down toward the lakes. It was lying on its side on the rocky bank of the stream. At first, in the dark, I couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a mass of dark fur. I killed my headlamp and crouched there, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then the starlight caught its face and I understood. It was a Bigfoot. A full-grown Bigfoot, lying on its side, possibly unconscious or possibly just too sick or hurt to move. I'm not going to spend time trying to convince you that what I saw was real. Either you believe me or you don't. I can tell you that everything changed in that moment. Shifted. The framework I'd been operating in, the frame that had room for bears and elk and mountain goats, but not for the thing I was looking at, got torn apart. I went from being a person hunting deer in a mountain wilderness to being a person standing 5 feet from something that absolutely should not exist, according to everything I knew about biology and the world. My hands started shaking, not from fear exactly, though fear was part of it, more from the sheer conceptual weight of what I was seeing. Everything I understood about the world just stopped making sense. I wanted to run. I considered it seriously, multiple times in those first minutes. A man standing 5 feet from a sleeping 7-foot-tall creature. That man's instinct is to put distance between himself and the thing. My legs were ready to move. My brain was ready to make that decision. The survival instinct was strong and loud. Every cell in my body was telling me to run. But something stopped me. Some ancient part of me that was older than fear, older than survival instinct, recognized something in the situation and said, "Stay." A man standing 5 feet from a sleeping 7-foot-tall creature. That man's instinct is to put distance between himself and the thing. My legs were ready to move. My brain was ready to make that decision. But something stopped me. Some part of me that was older than the fear recognized something in the situation and said, "Stay." The Bigfoot was massive, 7 feet long, maybe more, with a barrel chest and shoulders that looked almost as wide as I was tall. Its fur was dark, a deep brown that was almost black in the starlight, long and coarse and matted in places with dried blood. The smell hit me next, wet fur and musk and something else, something sharp and slightly rank, not hostile, just present, just the smell of an animal that was sick and injured and running a fever. It wasn't the smell of a predator in attack mode. It was the smell of suffering, the smell of an animal that was hurt and had been hurt for a long time. I've smelled enough injured animals to know the difference between the smell of fear and aggression and the smell of infection and pain. This was pain. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, just trying to make myself move, trying to force my body to respond to the command to leave. But my body wouldn't obey. My body wanted to stay, wanted to know what this creature was, wanted to understand. My mind was racing through possibilities, cycling through frameworks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But underneath all that mental chaos was something else. Something that recognized the creature's pain. Something that knew suffering when it saw it, trying to make sense of what my eyes were telling me. Then I focused on the reason it was lying down. Its left rear leg was badly injured. Even in the dark, I could see the problem. There was a steel trap around its lower leg, an old-style bear trap with teeth. The kind of trap that was common in the Wallowas 30 years ago before most trapping was banned. The leg below the trap was swollen massively, twice the normal size, maybe 3 times the normal size. The fur around the trap was matted with blood that had dried to black. The wound was infected. I could see it from where I stood. The fur around the trap was crusted with pus, and there was a discharge running down the leg. And that was the smell underneath the musk. Infection, fever, sepsis, the bacterial signature of something that was being eaten from the inside. The Bigfoot's eyes were closed. It was breathing, shallow breaths that came irregularly, like the breathing of something that was running a high fever. Its left front arm was covering part of the injured leg, like even in its fever state, it knew the leg was the problem and was trying to protect it. That gesture, that simple act of protecting an injury, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mindless animal. This was a creature that understood its own body, that knew it was hurt, that was trying in its own way to protect itself. I made myself take a step forward, then another. The creature didn't move. I got close enough to put my hand near its face. It didn't react. I checked its pulse on the side of its neck. There was one, strong and fast, running probably over 100 beats a minute, maybe 120. A fever pulse, the body working overtime to fight an infection that was consuming it from the inside. I could feel the heat radiating from the creature's body, even though I wasn't touching it directly. The skin was burning. The creature's body was literally trying to cook the infection, to burn it away with heat. But the fever had gone too high. The body doesn't know the difference between fighting an infection and burning itself out. It just applies heat indiscriminately, and fever becomes a weapon against itself. I checked the temperature of the ravine. The night air was cold, probably in the low 30s. This was good. The cold would help moderate the fever, would make it harder for the body to run at such unsustainable temperatures. But it wasn't enough. The creature needed intervention beyond what cold air could provide. A fever pulse. The body working overtime to fight an infection that was killing it. The artery was thumping underneath the fur, and the skin was hot to the touch. Hot like a radiator. Hot like the creature's body was cooking itself, trying to burn out the infection. I had no idea what to do. I was standing in a ravine at 4 in the morning with an infected Bigfoot at my feet, and absolutely no idea how to help it, or whether I should try. Every impulse I had was contradictory. Leave the creature alone? That's what my father had taught me. Let it fend for itself. Let nature take its course. But leaving it to die from an infection I could potentially treat felt like a kind of cruelty. It felt like choosing inaction when action was possible. I thought about the trap. Someone had set that trap. Someone had placed it there deliberately, trying to catch whatever they could, probably not even expecting something as large as a Bigfoot. They'd succeeded, and then they'd abandoned it, or hadn't checked it, or didn't care. The trap had been there for weeks, at least. The creature had suffered for weeks. Every day the infection had gotten worse. Every day it had gotten more likely that the creature would die. I could save it. I had the tools. I had the knowledge. I had the first aid kit. I had antibiotics. I could approach the creature, work the trap open, clean the wound, apply medication, give the creature a chance. But I could also be killed in the process. A sick animal is an unpredictable animal. Its pain and fervor could make it strike at anything, including the person trying to help it. One swipe from those massive claws and I could be seriously injured, possibly fatally. Leaving it felt like a kind of murder. Trying to help it felt like a kind of suicide. I was frozen between those two poles, unable to move in either direction. I had no idea what to do. I was standing in a ravine at 4 in the morning with an infected Bigfoot at my feet, and no idea how to help it or whether I should try. Leaving it felt wrong. The infection was obviously in the advanced stages. Without intervention, sepsis would kill it within days, maybe less. The body can only fight a spreading infection for so long before the fever goes too high or the heart can't keep pace with the demands. But trying to help meant getting close to something that was 7 feet tall and could kill me if it wanted to. The trap on its leg was rusted and old, probably had been on there for weeks or longer. Getting the trap off meant getting very close to the Bigfoot's body and working the mechanism while the creature was in pain. One wrong move, and it could strike without thinking. One spasm, and it could break my arm or my neck. I went back to my camp, and I got my first aid kit, and I made coffee. The act of making coffee was grounding. It was something normal, something familiar, something that required attention to detail without requiring emotional energy. I had to gather wood. I had to arrange it in a fire pit. I had to get embers going from my fire starter. I had to wait for water to boil. Each step was a step away from the ravine, away from the creature, away from the thing I'd just seen that shouldn't exist. I sat by my fire in the dark, waiting for the water to heat, and I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I tried to fit it into frameworks that I understood. I tried to explain it away as a bear, as a large human, as a trick of the light and shadow and distance. But I couldn't. The proportions were wrong. The movement was wrong. The way it had crossed the meadow was nothing like any animal I'd ever seen. And there was no way to mistake what I'd encountered for anything other than what it was, a creature that shouldn't exist, according to everything I understood about biology and evolution and the world. The coffee was black and strong, and it burned my tongue. That small pain was real. That small sensation was a touchstone to reality. I was real. The coffee was real. The mountains were real. And somewhere down there in that ravine, the creature was real, dying slowly of an infection, breathing shallow breaths, burning up from a fever. I went back to my camp, and I got my first aid kit, and I made coffee. I used the time to think. The sun came up somewhere in that process. The light changed from gray to gold, and the forest came alive. The birds started singing. The world became normal again, except for the fact that I knew what was down in that ravine, and that knowledge changed everything. I was still standing there trying to figure out what to do about a dying animal that I couldn't prove existed and couldn't take to a vet. I came back down to the ravine at first light. The Bigfoot hadn't moved. Its breathing was the same, shallow and irregular. Its eyes were still closed. Up close in the daylight, I could see that the infected leg was in really bad shape. The trap had been on for days, at least. Days of the animal limping on a leg that was getting worse by the hour. Days of trying to walk on an injury that was getting more infected with every step. The swelling was stretching the skin tight. In places where the trap teeth had actually punctured the skin, the infection had burrowed down into the muscle tissue. If the Bigfoot didn't get treatment soon, if the infection spread much further, it would die. The fever would spike high enough to cause organ failure, or the infection would spread to the bone, and the leg would become gangrenous, and even if I did remove the trap, the leg would have to be amputated or the creature would die from the spreading rot. I made a decision. I was going to try to get the trap off. If the Bigfoot woke up and wanted to kill me, it would kill me. But at least I'd have tried to do something other than leave it to die. I approached from the creature's back, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The Bigfoot didn't wake. The fever had it deep. I got close enough to examine the trap and the leg. The trap mechanism was corroded beyond what I would have thought possible. This wasn't just surface rust. This was deep structural rust, the kind that happens when metal is exposed to the elements for years at a time, when blood and biological matter provide an acidic environment that accelerates the corrosion. The locking arm was essentially welded into place by rust, a solid piece where it was supposed to be a movable mechanism. The trap itself was a bear trap, maybe 20 years old, maybe older. I'd seen these kinds of traps at flea markets and gun shows, relics from an earlier time when trapping was more common in the Wallowas. They were terrible devices, designed to maim as much as to capture, designed to hold an animal by crushing its limb until the trapper arrived to finish it off. The teeth on the jaws were like serrated knives, capable of tearing through fur and flesh and into bone. And this trap had been on the Bigfoot's leg for weeks, crushing and grinding and creating an infection that had nearly killed it. The trap mechanism was corroded. Rust had seized the locking arm. It wasn't going to open without force. I had a knife in my pack. It was a good knife, sharp, but using a knife as a lever on corroded metal wasn't going to work without potentially breaking the blade. I went back to my camp again, and I looked through my gear. What I had was a bow, arrows, a rifle, a first aid kit, some cordage, a tarp, a sleeping bag, and camping gear. None of it was going to help me lever open a rusted bear trap. Then I remembered the spike on my climbing axe. I used it sometimes to belay anchor points into rock. It might work as a lever. It was hardened steel, not likely to break, and it had a point that might fit into the trap mechanism. I hoped. By the time I got back to the ravine with the axe, the Bigfoot was awake. Not fully. Its eyes were open but clouded, unfocused. It was looking at something I couldn't see, lost in the fever state where reality is uncertain and pain is the only thing that's clear. Its left front arm was still over the trap, the massive claws pressed into the ground like it was trying to dig, trying to find some way to relieve the pressure on the injured leg. When it saw me coming, there was no recognition, no awareness, just the eyes of something in pain and fever, looking at a shape that was moving in its direction. The pupils were dilated, taking in as much light as possible. The creature was burning up inside. I worked the spike of the climbing axe under the locking mechanism. I had to work carefully. One wrong move, and I could damage my only tool, leaving me with no way to open the trap. Worse, one wrong move could cause the Bigfoot to wake in pain and turn on me reflexively. A creature that size, even sick and feverish, could break my arms or my neck without meaning to. I started at the locking arm, the part that held the trap jaws closed. The rust had formed a seal, almost, welding the metal parts together. I'd seen this before with old equipment, where rust doesn't just coat the surface but actually fuses the metal, making it function as one piece instead of separate components. Breaking that fusion would take force and precision and probably a lot of patience. I leaned on the axe and felt resistance. My weight wasn't enough. I shifted my grip, got better leverage, and leaned again. I felt something give maybe a half-inch. The sound was terrible in the quiet of the ravine, a harsh scraping that echoed off the rock walls. The Bigfoot's breathing changed, became more shallow. Its eyes flickered but didn't fully open. I stayed frozen, waiting for it to move, to strike, to do something. But it just lay there, fever lost, trapped in a reality it couldn't fully comprehend. I tried again. This time, the spike moved easier, maybe because I'd already broken some of the rust seal, maybe because I was getting the angle right. Another quarter-inch, then another. I was making progress, but progress was measured in fractions of inches, and it was going to take longer than I'd hoped. My shoulders were already burning from the leverage required. My hands were slippery with sweat despite the cold. I worked the spike of the climbing axe under the locking mechanism. One wrong move and the spike would break or bend, and I'd be out of options. The mechanism was seized, rusted solid from weeks of exposure and blood and swelling. I leaned on the axe and felt the resistance for a moment. Then something gave. The mechanism moved maybe a quarter-inch. The sound of the metal moving, after being frozen in place for so long, was a harsh scraping noise. I reset and leaned again. Another quarter-inch. The Bigfoot made a sound, not an attack sound. A sound of pain. The creature's eyes focused for a moment, and I saw awareness come into them. It saw me. Its massive jaws opened, and I thought that was it. That was the moment where I was about to learn what it felt like, to be torn apart by something large and desperate. But it didn't attack. It didn't lunge at me or try to strike. It closed its eyes again and made another sound, different from the first. Lower. Almost questioning, like it was asking me what I was doing or asking itself why I was still there. The sound was almost like language, almost like the creature was trying to communicate something, like it understood that I was trying to help. I worked the axe spike again, and I was starting to feel the toll of the effort. My shoulders were burning. My hands were blistered from the force I was applying. The ground was hard and cold beneath me. The Bigfoot's breathing was still irregular, still that shallow breathing of high fever. But there was something different about it now, something slightly deeper, as if somewhere in its unconscious state, the creature was responding to what was happening, was understanding that relief was coming. The mechanism was getting looser. I could feel it. Each time I applied force, there was a little more give. The rust was breaking away in flakes now, red dust on my hands and on the trap. I was beginning to see where the individual parts of the mechanism connected, to understand how the trap had been constructed, to anticipate where the next leverage point would be. The trap was becoming a puzzle that I was solving with my body, with force and patience, and the slow accumulation of small movements. I was beginning to see where the lever points were, where the corrosion had actually weakened the structure. I was beginning to see where the lever points were, where the corrosion had actually weakened the structure. Another angle, another push. The mechanism moved an inch, then 2 inches. The locking arms started to separate from the trap housing. The rust was breaking away in small flakes. The metal was beginning to move for the first time in weeks. It took me maybe 20 minutes to get the trap open far enough that the jaws would release. 30 minutes if you count all the steps and all the resets when the leverage angle was wrong. When the jaws finally came free, they fell open, and the Bigfoot's leg came away from the trap. The creature made no move to attack me. It just lay there, breathing. The infected leg suddenly free, the weight suddenly gone. The relief had to be immediate, even through the fever. The pressure that had been compressing the wound for all those weeks was gone. The leg was a mess. The trap teeth had gone through the fur and into the flesh. The skin was shredded under the fur. The swelling had been compressing an infected wound, and once the pressure came off, blood and pus started flowing. I moved back away from the Bigfoot and pulled out my first aid kit. I had saline, antibiotics, bandages, antiseptic, professional medical supplies from hunting injuries and emergency situations. I had enough to clean the wound and get a basic dressing on it. But I didn't have enough to do anything meaningful for a sepsis infection. Cleaning the surface of a wound and applying bandages doesn't address the bacteria that are already in the blood, the systemic infection that's spreading through the body. The Bigfoot watched me work, or watched my hands work. Its eyes never came fully into focus. I worked as carefully as I could, cleaning away the dead tissue and discharge, pouring saline to flush the infection out as much as I could. The creature made small sounds when I touched the worst parts, pained sounds, but not aggressive. It lay there and let me work. It submitted to the care like it understood that I was trying to help it, like it somehow knew that I was on its side. By the time I was done, it was midday. I'd cleaned and bandaged the leg as well as I could. I had applied an antibiotic salve to the wound and wrapped it in clean gauze. It would buy some time, maybe. But the infection was systemic. The Bigfoot was running a fever that spoke of something deep in the blood. Antibiotics and clean bandages weren't enough by themselves. What the creature needed was something that would get into the bloodstream and fight the infection from inside. What I had was topical treatment. It was a start. It was something. I made a decision in the moment that changes everything that comes after this. It wasn't a deliberate decision, exactly. It was more like my body made the decision without consulting my brain. I found myself moving my camp down to the ravine before I'd consciously decided to do so. I found myself planning my days around caring for the creature before I'd thought through the implications of staying. The decision wasn't made at a moment of conscious choice. It was made in 1,000 small moments, in the 10,000 small actions that comprised staying instead of leaving. But there was one moment where I consciously chose, where I made the deliberate decision to commit to this path. It was late morning on the Monday I found the creature. after I'd spent the night not sleeping, after I'd sat by my cold fire trying to figure out what to do. I was holding the first aid kit, looking at the saline and the antibiotics and the bandages, and I realized that I was going to use all of it on this creature. I was going to commit whatever supplies I had to keeping it alive. I was going to stop being a hunter and start being a nurse. It was a choice that would affect everything that came after. It would change how I saw myself. It would change my relationship with the wilderness. It would change my marriage, my career, my understanding of what I was capable of. That choice, made in that moment, with that sick creature in front of me, would ripple through the next 2 decades of my life. I made a decision in the moment that changes everything that comes after this. I decided to stay. I was going to take my camp supplies, the hunting gear, everything I had, and I was going to use it to try to keep that Bigfoot alive. I was going to stay there until either it recovered or it didn't. I was going to stop being a hunter and start being a caretaker for something that shouldn't exist. I moved my entire camp down to the ravine. It took me 3 trips, each one carrying supplies in my arms or in my pack, or tied into bundles. The first trip took my sleeping bag, and my tarp, and my fire-making supplies. The second trip took my food and water and first aid kit. The third trip took what was left, my bow, my rifle, the miscellaneous supplies that I wouldn't need for the next few days, but didn't want to leave behind if I had to leave quickly. Each time I came back to the ravine, the Bigfoot watched me. The creature's eyes tracked my movements, following me as I set up the camp on the opposite side of the ravine from where it lay. I was careful to stay far enough away that the creature wouldn't feel threatened, but close enough that I could monitor its condition, could see if its breathing changed, could see if the fever got worse. By the time I had the camp fully set up, it was late morning. The sun was high and warm, at least relatively warm for the mountains. The day was clear. The forecast I'd checked before leaving Joseph had said good weather for the next week, and it looked like that was holding true. For a few more days, I'd have clear skies and mild days, which would make staying in the ravine easier. I moved my entire camp down to the ravine. It took me 3 trips to get everything moved. The Bigfoot watched me each time I came back. The creature's fever seemed to be getting worse. The breathing was more labored. By the time I had my camp set up on the far side of the ravine, I was genuinely worried the Bigfoot wouldn't last the night. The creature's heart rate was visible, the pulse pounding in the neck, working overtime to push blood through a system that was under siege from infection. The big thing I didn't have was antibiotics that would actually work for systemic infection. Topical antibiotic salve is not the same as systemic infection treatment. What the Bigfoot needed was something that would get into the blood and kill the bacteria that was causing the fever. What I had was limited medical supplies designed for treating human hunting injuries, not for treating infected Bigfoot legs. I sat there thinking about this problem, and I realized I had one option, a risky option, but an option nonetheless. I had prescription antibiotics in my first aid kit, amoxicillin, prescribed to me 3 years ago for an infection I got from a knife cut while processing elk. I never finished the course. I had most of a bottle of 500 milligram tablets sitting in a Ziploc bag in my pack. It wasn't ideal. Giving human medication to an animal is not a medical recommendation. The dosage would be wrong. The effectiveness would be unknown. The risk was real. But it was something. It was an option, and without it, I knew the Bigfoot would die. The problem was getting the Bigfoot to take it. I couldn't explain what the pills were. I couldn't tell it to swallow them. I couldn't reason with it. I had to somehow convince a 7-foot-tall infected creature that I was trying to help it, not harm it. A creature that could kill me if it wanted to. A creature that was running a fever high enough to make it dangerous and unpredictable. I crushed some of the pills and mixed them with water and honey from my pack. The honey was old, crystallized, but still usable. I warmed it over my fire, using a small metal cup I had in my pack, warming it just enough to soften it, but not so much that it would lose the honey's antimicrobial properties. I crushed the pills between 2 rocks, grinding the amoxicillin into fine powder. Then I stirred the powder into the warm honey and water, creating a paste that was thick enough to hold together, but soft enough to spread on my hand. The paste smelled like chemistry and sweetness, an odd combination. I wasn't sure the Bigfoot would accept it. I wasn't sure my body would accept the idea of actually doing this, of approaching a 7-foot-tall creature and offering it medication derived from my own survival kit. But there was no other way, and the creature needed the medication more than I needed the security of having it. I crushed some of the pills and mixed them with water and honey from my pack. I made a paste. The honey helped to mask the taste of the medicine and added calories that the creature needed. Then I approached the Bigfoot slowly and carefully held the paste out on my hand. The creature watched me come. Its eyes were still clouded with fever, but there was something behind them, some awareness that I was trying to do something. When I got close, it smelled my hand. Its nostrils flared. The musk smell got stronger as the creature tensed. Then slowly, carefully, it licked the paste from my palm. I felt the texture of its tongue, rough and large, and I felt the weight of the moment. I was touching something that shouldn't exist. I was touching something that could end me with a single swipe of its claws, and I was doing it to help. I did this again the next morning with more crushed pills, and again on Wednesday morning, and again on Thursday morning. Each time, the Bigfoot took the medication a little more readily, like it was learning the routine, learning that I was the one bringing relief, that the paste on my palm meant something good was happening. Each time I came to it, the creature's eyes would focus a little more. The fever wasn't breaking yet, but it seemed like the medication was helping, like the infection was losing its grip, like the creature's body was beginning to fight back. I spent those days doing nothing but caring for the Bigfoot. I cleaned the wound twice a day, flushing it with saline, applying fresh antibiotic salve, changing the bandages. I monitored its breathing, its pulse, the temperature of its skin. I tried different foods, leaving berries and roots and water within reach. Most of it went untouched, but I saw evidence that the creature was eating some things on its own, leaves and plants it dug from the ground with those massive claws, foods that its body recognized as necessary. I didn't hunt. I didn't really sleep. I dozed in fragments, waking at every sound, at every change in the Bigfoot's breathing. I'd sit for hours just watching the creature, studying its features, trying to understand what I was looking at. The face was almost human, but not quite. The proportions were wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The brow ridge was more pronounced than a human's. The jaw was more powerful. The eyes were set differently, further apart, giving the face a width that no human face had. But there was something in those eyes, even when they were fever-clouded, that spoke of intelligence, of awareness, of a mind inside the body. I did this again the next morning with more crushed pills. The Bigfoot took it again. The fever hadn't broken, but the creature was alert enough to recognize my approach and to accept the medication. That was something. That was a sign that the medication was getting into the system, that the Bigfoot's body was beginning to fight back against the infection. Monday night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my side of the ravine, and I watched the Bigfoot breathe, and I listened to the forest, and I tried to make sense of what I was doing. I had abandoned my hunt. I had abandoned any pretense of a normal trip. I was sitting in a remote part of the Wallowa Mountains, nursing an infected Bigfoot back to health. And if anyone had found out, I would have become a person of ridiculous interest or a person who was making things up for attention. Either way, I was in a place where there was no going back. The knowledge of this creature's existence was inside me now. The choice I was making to help it, rather than document it or report it, was a choice I'd have to live with. A choice that would shape the rest of my life. Tuesday morning, the fever broke. It happened gradually, and I want you to understand that I was watching for it so carefully that I almost missed it. I'd spent so much time looking for signs of the fever breaking that when it actually happened, it was subtle enough that I could have overlooked it. But I didn't. I was tuned into this creature's state of being with such precise attention that I could feel the smallest shift. The breathing was the first sign. It went from shallow and rapid to deeper and slower. The creature's chest was moving more fully, taking in bigger breaths, working less hard to circulate oxygen. That change happened over maybe an hour, so gradual that you wouldn't notice it if you weren't watching closely. But I was watching closely. I'd barely slept in 3 days. I was running on adrenaline and coffee and the knowledge that this creature's life depended on my monitoring its condition. Then the eyes came into focus. The creature's eyes opened, and for the first time since I'd found it, there was actual awareness behind them. Not the fever-glazed stare of someone trapped in illness, but actual consciousness. The creature looked at me, and I could see recognition in that look. Not recognition of me specifically, but recognition of the world, of reality, of the fact that it existed and was experiencing existence. That's when I knew it was going to survive. Tuesday morning, the fever broke. It happened gradually. The Bigfoot's breathing became deeper. Its eyes opened and actually focused. It looked at me, and there was awareness in that look, knowledge, understanding. The creature recognized that I was the person who was there. The creature knew that I had taken the trap off. The creature understood, on some level, that I was trying to help. There was no hostility in that look. There was no predatory calculation. There was something closer to gratitude, or at least acknowledgement. A recognition that something had shifted. The change was dramatic. By mid-morning, the creature was trying to move. Not far, just shifts of position, ways to relieve pressure on the injured leg. By afternoon, it was attempting to stand. It got up on 3 legs and held its weight there for about 10 seconds before it had to lie back down. But the fact that it was trying, that it was moving, that meant the fever had broken. The antibiotics were working, the body was beginning to heal. Tuesday through Thursday was a process of watching the Bigfoot recover. The fever breaking was like watching ice melt. It didn't happen all at once, it happened gradually, then suddenly. Tuesday morning I noticed the breathing was deeper. Tuesday afternoon the eyes came into focus. By Tuesday evening the creature was watching me move around the camp, not tracking me aggressively, but following me with its eyes, aware of my presence, understanding that I was there. Wednesday morning it tried to get up. Not successfully, but it tried. It got up on its front legs and pushed itself forward maybe 2 feet before the injured rear leg gave out and it collapsed back down. The attempt lasted maybe 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds told me everything. The fever was breaking. The infection was losing its hold. The creature's body was remembering how to survive, how to move, how to do the things that creatures do. Wednesday afternoon, it was moving around the ravine on 3 legs. Not graceful, not fast, but moving. It made its way to the stream and drank. That was the moment I knew it was going to survive. That simple act of moving to water and drinking told me the creature had re-entered the world of the living. It had accepted that this was where it was, that this was what it needed to do to continue existing. By Thursday, it was stronger. The creature was moving with more confidence. The injured leg still wasn't supporting full weight, but it was closer to functional. The creature was using it occasionally, testing it, building strength in it incrementally. The swelling had receded significantly. The wound was beginning to scab over properly, the body's own healing mechanism kicking in. The discharge had decreased to almost nothing. The fever was completely gone. The infection had lost its grip. The creature was going to survive. That was certain now. The only question was how quickly it would recover, how much strength it would regain, how fully it would function with a leg that would always carry the memory of being crushed in a trap. The swelling in the leg was beginning to recede. The discharge from the wound was decreasing. The fever was completely gone. The Bigfoot was a different creature than the one I'd found in the ravine 4 days earlier. It was aware, alert, cognizant of its own recovery. Tuesday through Thursday was a process of watching the Bigfoot recover. The fever stayed down. The leg started to improve. The swelling began to recede. The discharge lessened. By Wednesday, the creature was trying to stand and was managing it for longer periods. By Thursday, it was actually moving around the ravine on 3 legs, still limping badly on the infected leg, but mobile. It was moving to the stream and drinking. It was beginning to reconnect with the world outside its fever. The Bigfoot didn't eat anything while I was there in the traditional sense. I tried leaving elk meat that I had in my pack, the frozen packages of meat I'd been planning to take out at the end of the hunt. The creature ignored it. I don't know if it was because the fever had killed its appetite or because the creature had different dietary preferences than I assumed. It's not like I could ask. There were berries growing in places around the ravine, late-season berries that were still available at that elevation, and I saw the Bigfoot eating those, and I saw it digging at the base of some plants and eating roots or tubers or whatever it was finding. So it was getting nutrition, just not from what I was offering. The creature knew what it needed. It was listening to its own body and finding what worked. By Thursday afternoon, I was running low on supplies. I'd used up most of my food keeping myself alive for 4 days of constant activity. I'd used up my first aid supplies, cleaning and bandaging the Bigfoot's leg. I'd used up my water purification tablets, though there was clean running water. I'd used up my camping fuel boiling water for cleaning and coffee and just trying to stay warm through the cold nights. Every resource I'd brought into this ravine had been converted into care for the creature. I sat by my campfire on Thursday evening, and I calculated what I had left. Enough food for 1 more day, maybe, if I rationed it carefully. Enough first aid supplies for 1 more day of wound care. Enough fuel for a few more cups of coffee or boiled water. I was depleted, and the Bigfoot was recovering. Those 2 facts existed in tension, pulling in opposite directions. By Thursday afternoon, I was running low on supplies. My food was nearly gone. My water treatment tablets were gone. Though there was a clean stream, my camping fuel was nearly gone. My medications were nearly gone. My first aid supplies were depleted. I'd come to the Wallowas with supplies for a 7-day solo hunt. I had used them trying to keep an infected Bigfoot alive. It was time to make a decision. I could stay and risk running out of supplies entirely, risk not having enough food to make it down the mountain, or I could go and trust that the creature would make it from here. I spent Thursday evening deciding what to do. The Bigfoot was improving, but it wasn't healed. The leg was better, but it would take weeks of healing before it was fully functional. The creature was still at risk from infection returning if the wound wasn't kept clean. Still at risk from malnutrition if it didn't start eating more substantially. Walking away felt premature and cruel, but staying meant hiking out the next day with depleted supplies and potentially risking my own health on the walkout. I could get weak, I could get injured, I could make a mistake in the backcountry that would cost me. That's not theoretical. People die in the wilderness every year because they stayed too long and ran out of resources. I made a decision. I was going to leave. But I was going to leave in a specific way. I had half my supply of medication left. I was going to leave it, along with instructions written as clearly as I could manage, and I was going to leave the injured leg bandaged and clean, and as healed as I could make it. I was going to do everything I could in the time I had left, and then I was going to let nature take its course. I was going to trust the Bigfoot to finish the healing that I could start. I spent all day Friday taking care of the Bigfoot's leg. I cleaned it again, changed the dressings, applied fresh antibiotic salve. I crushed and mixed the remaining antibiotics with more honey and water, and I used up all of it, getting the medication into the creature's system. By Friday evening, the Bigfoot was alert and stable. The fever was completely gone. The leg was still injured, but dramatically better than it had been. The creature knew who I was. It watched me move around the camp. When I sat down, it would move to within a few feet of me and just rest, like the proximity to me was somehow reassuring, like the presence of another living being that wasn't trying to kill it was valuable. The creature seemed to understand that I was about to leave. Friday evening, I packed up my camp, and I want you to understand what that meant. It meant leaving behind a creature I'd spent 4 days keeping alive. It meant leaving behind a connection that had changed me in fundamental ways. It meant choosing to end a relationship that had begun in crisis and had developed into something deeper than I could quite articulate. I'd spent 4 days touching this creature, caring for it, communicating with it in the only way I could, through presence and action and a willingness to help. We'd developed a kind of understanding, the creature and I. It knew I wasn't going to hurt it. It had learned my voice, my footsteps, the way I moved around the camp, and now I was leaving it behind. I spent that afternoon sitting with the Bigfoot, not doing anything, not cleaning wounds or administering medication or flushing infections, just sitting. The creature lay there with its head on the ground, watching me. The scar on its leg was already beginning to form, the wound scabbing over, the body's ancient mechanism for healing kicking in. In a few weeks, maybe less, the scab would fall off and there would be a scar, permanent evidence of what had happened, permanent evidence of the trap and the suffering and the healing. I thought about not leaving. I thought about staying there for another week or another month until the leg was completely healed. I thought about building a more permanent camp, about finding a way to supply myself with food, about staying in that ravine indefinitely, if that's what it took. But even as I thought these things, I knew they were fantasies. I couldn't stay forever. I couldn't change my life that completely. I had a job in Joseph. I had a truck payment. I had a life that required my presence, however much I hated that life, however much I'd rather be here. So I packed what I needed, and I left behind everything that might be useful to the creature. I left behind everything that I couldn't carry and still make it down the mountain safely. Friday evening, I packed up my camp. I left behind everything that might be useful to the creature. My extra tarp, spread on a rock where the Bigfoot could shelter under it if it rained. My sleeping pad, insulation against the cold ground. My clothing. I was wearing a light synthetic layer, and I left behind a heavier wool sweater that might provide extra warmth. The honey I'd been using for the medication, left in a container the creature could potentially open. The trail mix, spread in piles on the ground. A full bottle of water, placed at the creature's level. I left notes. I know that sounds absurd, leaving written instructions for a Bigfoot. But I wrote them anyway. I wrote "Stay safe" in large letters on a piece of cardboard, using a pencil to write dark letters that might be visible from a distance. I don't know if the creature could read. I don't know if it could understand written language. But I needed to do it anyway. I needed to feel like I was communicating something, even if the communication was one-directional. I left behind everything that might be useful to the creature. My extra tarp, my sleeping pad, a week's supply of calories worth of honey and trail mix spread out where the Bigfoot could find it. I left behind a full bottle of water. I left behind my fear and my disbelief, and I left behind the part of me that thought I should report this to someone, that I should tell Wildlife Services or a government agency what I had found and where. I decided in that moment that some things belong to themselves and not to institutions. Some things need to be left alone. Some creatures need privacy more than they need help from official channels. Saturday morning before first light, I left the ravine. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving the Bigfoot time to follow if it wanted to. The creature did follow, moving on 3 legs, still limping but mobile, moving from its lying place to the edge of my camp. I gathered my pack. I gathered my bow and rifle. I looked around one final time to make sure I wasn't leaving behind something critical. The Bigfoot watched me prepare to leave. It understood on some level that I was going. The creature made a sound, not quite speech, but not quite animal sound either. Something in between, something that might have been a question or might have been a goodbye or might have been both. I stopped and looked at the creature one more time. 7 feet of muscle and fur and intelligence and survival. A creature that had been dying when I found it. A creature that I'd brought back from the edge. A creature that would live out its life in these mountains, carrying a scar as evidence of both suffering and salvation. "Stay safe," I said to it. "This is your home. You belong here. Stay safe." The creature made that sound again. And then I turned and started walking up the ravine. Saturday morning before first light, I left the ravine. The Bigfoot walked with me to the edge of the camp and watched me go. I didn't look back until I got to the trailhead. When I did look back, the creature was standing on a high point above the ravine, silhouetted against the dawn sky, watching me leave. That was the last time I saw it. That image is burned into my memory. The shape of it backlit by the morning light, watching me walk away, the silhouette of something that shouldn't exist, but did exist, and had changed me by existing. Something fundamental had shifted in the world. I came down out of the Wallowas and I tried to figure out what had happened to me. That hike down took me all day. I moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to hurt myself on the steep sections. Part of me wanted to rush down, to get back to civilization, to try to return to normal life as quickly as possible. But another part of me didn't want to leave, didn't want to come back to the world where what I'd experienced would seem impossible, where I'd have to pretend that none of it had happened. By the time I reached the truck, it was getting dark. I sat there for a long time before I drove. I sat in the cab with the door open and I just looked at the mountains. I thought about the Bigfoot, probably moving around that ravine, probably checking to see if I was coming back, probably wondering what had happened to the man who'd helped it. The drive back to Joseph took me through the evening and into the night. The road was empty. I passed maybe 3 cars. I didn't stop for food or coffee. I just drove, and I thought about what I was going to do. Could I go to wildlife services? Could I tell them what I'd seen? Could I try to get them to protect the creature, to keep humans away from that ravine? I already knew the answer. My father had known it. If I reported the creature would be hunted. Scientists would come. Photographers would come. Thrill seekers would come. The mountain would be invaded by people trying to prove something that needed to stay secret. So I decided not to tell anyone. I decided to carry the knowledge alone. I decided to become like my father, silent and solitary in my knowledge, protecting a creature by not talking about it. I came down out of the Wallowas and I tried to figure out what had happened to me and what it meant, and whether I was ever going to go back up there again. And the answer to that last question is still complicated. It's still not fully resolved in my mind, even now. I came home from that trip and I didn't hunt the Wallowas for 3 years. Those 3 years were difficult in ways I'm not sure I can adequately explain to someone who hasn't carried a secret like that. The knowledge of the Bigfoot's existence was inside me like a second heartbeat. I'd think about it first thing in the morning when I woke up. I'd think about it last thing at night before I fell asleep. And I'd think about it constantly throughout the day. The first year was the hardest. I couldn't stop wondering if it had survived, The wound could have gotten infected again. The leg could have become gangrenous. The creature could have starved if it couldn't adapt to hunting on 3 legs. The antibiotics I'd left could have done more harm than good, could have upset its digestive system, could have caused complications I couldn't foresee. Every scenario played out in my head over and over. I'd lie awake at night running through them, analyzing them, trying to figure out the probability of each one. Work suffered. I was supposed to be framing a house for a developer, a new construction project that was supposed to take 3 months. I made mistakes. I didn't concentrate. I'd miss measurements. I'd have to redo work I'd done the day before. My boss finally asked me if I was okay, if something was going on. I told him I was fine, that I was just having an off year. He didn't believe me, but he didn't push it. My marriage was ending around that time, or had ended, or had been dying for years. I'm not really sure which. My wife and I didn't fight about anything specific. We just couldn't communicate anymore. She felt distant. I felt trapped. She wanted to know why I wasn't happy, and I couldn't tell her the truth, which was that I'd had an experience that had revealed the inadequacy of everything else in my life. How do you tell your wife that you spent 4 days in a ravine nursing a creature that shouldn't exist back to health, and now nothing else feels important? How do you explain that living in a normal house, working a normal job, maintaining a normal marriage, all of it feels like a pale imitation of what's real? So we separated. She got the house. I rented an apartment in Joseph. I went to work, came home, tried to sleep, and every night I thought about the Bigfoot. By the 2nd year, I'd started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Not seriously, not really, but there were moments when I'd think, what if that never happened? What if I hallucinated the whole encounter? What if the stress of my failing marriage created an elaborate fantasy, and I'm actually crazy? These thoughts would hit me at odd moments, at the grocery store, at work, while I was driving, and I'd have to stop and breathe and remind myself that it was real. The track was real. The trap was real. The wound was real. The creature was real. By the 3rd year, the constant doubt and wondering had worn me down. I wasn't sleeping well. I had lost weight. I looked older than I should have looked. A coworker asked me if I was sick. I said I was fine, just dealing with some personal stuff. But the truth was I was exhausted by the weight of the secret. I was exhausted by not being able to tell anyone. I was exhausted by wondering if the creature had survived, by imagining scenarios where it had died, by feeling responsible for its fate. I came home from that trip and I didn't hunt the Wallowas for 3 years. I couldn't face going back up there without wondering if the Bigfoot was still alive, without wondering if my intervention had helped or if I had just delayed something inevitable. The question haunted me. I'd lie awake at night wondering if I'd done more harm than good, wondering if the creature had died anyway, and I'd just extended its suffering, wondering if I should have left it alone. Those thoughts were poison. They colored everything I did for 3 years. They bled into my work. They made it hard to concentrate. They made it hard to sleep well. They made me question every choice I'd made in that ravine. I couldn't look at my hands without remembering the texture of its tongue on my palm. I couldn't hear the wind in the trees without thinking about the sounds it made. I couldn't be normal. I couldn't just go back to framing houses and having small talk with neighbors. Something inside me had cracked open and let something fundamental out, and I couldn't put it back. After 3 years, I made a decision. I was going to go back. The weight of not knowing had become unbearable. My marriage had ended by that point. Finalized, legal separation, no longer even trying. My work had improved slightly as I'd gotten more used to compartmentalizing my life, pushing the knowledge of the Bigfoot into a locked box in my mind and only opening it when I was alone. But I couldn't keep living like that. I couldn't keep carrying the burden of uncertainty. I took another week off work. My boss didn't ask questions anymore. He'd learned that sometimes I just needed to disappear into the mountains, and when I came back, I was better. I drove to the trailhead with a full backpack and a prayer that I would find what I'd lost. I was going to go back to that ravine, and I was going to see what had happened. I was going to find out if the Bigfoot had survived or if my effort had been wasted. After 3 years of uncertainty, I needed an answer. I went back up there in September, same time of year, different season of my life. I hiked to the ravine, expecting to find nothing, expecting the place to be empty of anything but the ghosts of what I had done there. I was older by 3 years. I was different. The man who left had been young enough to think he could change things with his hands and his will. The man who came back was older and less sure of anything. The leg was healed, completely, and I felt something release inside my chest when I confirmed it. A pressure I'd been carrying for 3 years suddenly lifted. The creature had survived. The trap had come off. The infection had cleared. The leg had healed. Everything I'd hoped for when I left the ravine that morning had come to pass. There was a scar, visible in the places where the trap teeth had gone through the fur and into the flesh. A line of lighter-colored hair where the scab had formed and then fallen away. The scar was stark, a permanent reminder of the injury and the trap and the suffering. But scars are also marks of survival. Scars are proof that a wound has healed. Scars are the evidence that life has continued despite injury. The swelling was completely gone. The infection was gone. The creature had survived. It had healed. And it had stayed in that high country, that alpine meadow and ravine system where I first found it dying of sepsis. That last detail told me something important. The creature had chosen to stay. It hadn't run to higher country, or lower country, or any other country. It had stayed in the place where it had suffered and healed, in the place where it had been helped by a human. That meant something. The leg was healed, completely. There was a scar, visible in the places where the trap teeth had gone through the fur and into the flesh. A line of lighter-colored hair where the scab had formed and then fallen away. But the swelling was completely gone. The infection was gone. The creature had survived. It had healed. And it had stayed in that high country, that alpine meadow and ravine system where I first found it dying of sepsis. I saw it 3 more times over the next 5 years, and each sighting was different in ways I didn't expect. The first time was about 4 years after I'd left it in the ravine. I'd gone back the previous year and found the leg healed, the scar visible, proof that it had survived. The relief I felt that day was profound. I'd carried the weight of not knowing for 3 years, and finally having confirmation that my intervention had worked, that the creature had lived, that it had healed, that relief had been almost physical. I'd sat down on a rock above the ravine and I'd cried. Just sat there on a mountainside in the Wallowa Mountains and cried because an animal I'd helped had survived. But I hadn't seen the creature itself that year. I'd just found the evidence of healing, and that had been enough to ease some of the weight. But in year 4, on my 3rd day back in the mountains, I saw it. I'd gone back the previous year and found the leg healed, the scar visible, proof that it had survived. But I hadn't seen the creature itself that year. I'd just found the evidence of healing, and that had been enough to ease some of the weight. But in year 4, on my 3rd day back in the mountains, I saw it. It was late afternoon, almost evening. I was hiking through the high alpine meadow where I'd first found the track, and movement caught my eye. I looked up and there, maybe 200 yards away, was the Bigfoot. It was moving through the grass with more confidence than I remembered. The injured leg wasn't perfect. I could see it still favored the other side, but it was functioning. The creature was moving with purpose, hunting or searching for food, or doing whatever Bigfoots do when they're not being stalked by the fever. When it saw me, it stopped, just stopped, and watched me. I was downwind, so it didn't smell me, but it saw me clearly. And in that moment, I could see recognition in its eyes. Not in the way animals recognize humans as a threat or as harmless. This was different. This was a creature looking at someone and remembering them. This was the Bigfoot remembering the man who'd freed it from the trap. It didn't come toward me. It didn't run. It just watched me for maybe 30 seconds, and I watched it. Then it turned and moved off into the forest, moving carefully but not frantically. It went into the timber and disappeared. But I knew it had recognized me. I knew that the connection we'd formed in that ravine had persisted. The second sighting was 2 years later. Same area, but this time it was spring instead of fall. I was doing some spring scouting, looking at areas where deer might be moving. I heard movement in the forest, the sound of something large moving through the brush. I thought it was an elk, but the sound was wrong, too deliberate, too specific. I stood still and watched, and the Bigfoot emerged from the trees, maybe 150 yards away. It was bigger than I remembered. Either it had grown, which was possible if it was younger than I'd thought, or I'd simply forgotten just how massive it was. It moved down a slope with that same distinctive two-legged gait, arms hanging naturally at its sides. It stopped at a small pool of water and drank. I watched it drink, and I could see the scar on its rear leg, the same scar, the same creature. This time when it looked in my direction, it seemed less surprised to see me, like it had expected I might be there. It looked at me for a moment, then continued on its way. It didn't seem threatened by my presence. It didn't seem concerned. It just seemed to accept that I was there, in its mountains, part of its world now. The third sighting was the most recent, 4 years ago, when I was 61. I was alone in the high country at the edge of the season, right at the boundary between fall and winter. The weather was turning. Snow was coming. The high passes were going to close soon. I was hiking through the transition zone where the alpine meadows give way to the dense forest, and I found it standing on a ridge, silhouetted against the sunset. It was old. I could see that now. Not young. Not the creature I'd met in the ravine more than a decade ago. It was still massive, still powerful, but there was age in the way it stood, in the way it moved. Its fur was grayer than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing it more clearly now. Maybe my eyes had adjusted to seeing this creature, to understanding its proportions and its shape. We looked at each other across maybe 100 yards of meadow. The wind was blowing from it toward me, but it still seemed to know I was there. It seemed to see me. And I swear, in that moment, it nodded. Just a slight movement of its head. And then it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. I haven't seen it since. That was 4 years ago. It's possible the creature died in the years since I last saw it. Large animals age, get sick, succumb to the same infections and injuries and illnesses that claim all living things. Or it's possible the creature is still alive, still in those mountains, still carrying the scar I helped create by freeing it from the trap. I don't know which is true. The uncertainty has become less painful over time. I've made peace with the possibility that it's dead, and I've made peace with the possibility that it's alive. Either way, I tried to help it, and that's what matters. It might be dead by now. Large animals don't live forever. The leg once infected might have complications later in life, or it might simply have decided to stay further away from humans, to move into deeper country where the mountains are more remote, less likely to see human hunters or hikers. I saw it 3 more times over the next 5 years, always at a distance, always at the edge of seasons, spring and fall, like those were the times when the creature moved through the lower elevations. It got bigger each time, or maybe just healthier, more filled out, more confident in its movement. The scar on its leg was always visible when I saw it, marking the place where the trap had been, marking the place where it had survived. I never tried to approach it again. I just watched from a distance, letting it know I was there, letting it see that I remembered. I'm 65 years old now. I still bow hunt the Wallowas in the fall. I haven't seen the Bigfoot in going on 3 years. It might be dead. It might have moved to higher country or different country entirely. It might just be better at avoiding human detection now, having experienced what that can mean. The memory of being trapped, of suffering, of needing help, might have taught it to stay further away, to move in deeper country, to avoid the places where humans come. Or it might be living its life completely unaware that I'm still looking for it, that I'm still marking trails and remembering the ravine and carrying that encounter with me. But every time I go up there, I think about those 3 days in that ravine. I think about the weight of its head against my leg, when it was recovering from the fever and seeking contact because the touch of another living thing was what it needed. I think about the moment when the trap finally came free and the weight of years lifted. I think about the way it looked at me when I left, not begging me to stay, just acknowledging that I had been there and that I was leaving and that something had changed between us. Something fundamental had shifted in the world. I've never told this story before publicly. I never went to wildlife services or game wardens or anyone in authority. I never tried to document it or photograph it or prove it. I let it be what it is. An encounter between a person and an animal. A moment of choice. A decision made in the wilderness where there was no one to judge it but me and the animal involved. The image of the creature silhouetted at the edge of that ravine as I walked away, that's an image I've never shared with anyone until now. If you're ever up in the Wallowa Mountains, if you're ever alone in that high country, in the fall or spring, pay attention to the signs, the tracks at water sources, the disturbed vegetation in unexpected patterns, the sounds in the dark that don't match anything you can name. They're out there. They're living their lives in the places where we barely ever venture, and they deserve the same mercy that any injured animal deserves. They deserve the choice I made, which was to see suffering and respond with help instead of fear. I learned something out there in that ravine that I've carried with me ever since. I learned that intelligence is not limited to what we can measure in a laboratory. I learned that consciousness exists on a spectrum, and that a creature can be intelligent in ways that don't match our definitions of intelligence. I learned that compassion is a choice we make, not an automatic response, and that the choice to help often requires sacrifice. I've spent the last 10 years thinking about the implications of that encounter. I think about what it means that creatures like this exist. I think about why they choose to hide from humans. I think about what we would do if we found conclusive proof of their existence. I think we would hunt them. I think we would document them. I think we would turn them into a curiosity, a scientific specimen, something to be studied and understood and ultimately controlled. And I think that would be a tragedy. My father understood this. He kept the secret of his encounter because he understood that some things don't need to be proven. Some things just need to exist, undisturbed, in the places where we barely venture. That's what I learned from him, and that's what the Bigfoot taught me directly. That sometimes the most important thing we can do for another creature is to leave it alone, to not report it, to not document it, to not try to prove it exists, to just let it be what it is, in the places where it belongs. I learned something out there in that ravine that I've carried with me ever since. I learned that Bigfoots are not monsters. They're living creatures that experience pain and fear and the need for help just like any other animal. They understand when someone is trying to hurt them and when someone is trying to help. They have individual personalities. They remember. They can form connections with other beings. They're intelligent in ways that go beyond what the scientists say is possible. And they deserve to be left alone, to live their lives in the mountains without interference or proof-seeking or documentation. That's my story. That's what I've carried with me for the better part of a decade, though it's closer to 2 decades now. Every single day, without exception, I think about that ravine. Every time I drive past Joseph on my way to somewhere else, I feel the pull of those mountains. Every fall, when the weather starts turning and the leaves change color and the world begins to shift into autumn, I feel the call to go back up there, to see if I can catch another glimpse of the creature. The pull never fades. If anything, it gets stronger as I get older. I'm approaching the age my father was when he died, and I find myself wondering if he spent his last years like I do now, thinking about the creature he'd seen, wondering about its fate, carrying the weight of that knowledge. Every single day, without exception, I think about that ravine. Every day I think about that ravine. Every time I drive past Joseph on my way to somewhere else, I think about those mountains. Every fall, when the weather starts turning, I feel the pull to go back up there, to see if I can catch another glimpse of the creature. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I went to the authorities. I have evidence, in a way. I have the knowledge, but knowledge of this kind is burden, not proof. No scientist would believe me without physical evidence, and I'm not going to provide physical evidence. I'm not going to let hunters find it. I'm not going to let the creature be turned into a museum piece or a research subject. So I keep the secret. I carry it alone, the way my father did, the way perhaps countless other people do, who've encountered something that shouldn't exist. There's a loneliness to that kind of knowledge. There's a burden that comes with being unable to share what you know, unable to tell anyone about the most profound experience of your life. But there's also a rightness to it. There's a kind of purity in the choice to protect rather than expose, to preserve mystery rather than solve it. Sometimes I wonder if other people have made this same choice. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there who've seen things that shouldn't exist, who've chosen silence over documentation, who've protected creatures by not reporting them. We're an invisible community, if we exist at all. We don't know each other. We don't meet or talk or share our experiences. But if we do exist, if there are others like me out there, then I want to tell them, you made the right choice. The creature doesn't need to be proven, it just needs to exist, undisturbed in the places where it belongs. So I keep the secret. I carry it alone, the way my father did, the way perhaps countless other people do. There are probably others out there who've seen something impossible, who've chosen silence over documentation, who've protected creatures by not reporting them. We're an invisible community, us keepers of secrets. We pass through the world without saying anything, without trying to prove anything, just living our normal lives and carrying the knowledge that the world is bigger and stranger than most people believe. My father died without ever fully telling me about his encounter. I don't know if he appreciated the fact that I understood, that I made the same choice he did. I don't know if he would have approved of what I did in that ravine, but I think he would have understood. I think he would have recognized in me the same understanding he'd had, the same knowledge that some things are better left mysterious. I'm 65 years old now, and I don't know how many more years I have to hunt the Wallowas. My knees aren't what they used to be. My eyes aren't as sharp. But I'll keep going up there as long as I can, keeping watch, making sure the creature is okay from a distance, protecting it by my silence. If this story reaches the right person, someone who's also seen something impossible, someone who's kept their own secrets, then maybe it will help you understand that you're not alone. Maybe it will help you understand that there are others out there who know what you know, who understand what you understand, who've made the same choice, to protect rather than expose. If this story reaches someone who thinks I'm lying, or making it up, or exaggerating, then I don't really care. Disbelief is actually the best protection a creature like that can have. If most people dismiss the Bigfoot as mythology and legend and folklore, then those creatures can live undisturbed. The hunters stay home. The researchers don't mount expeditions. The casual hikers don't look extra carefully. Disbelief is actually a form of protection. But if this story reaches someone who knows what I'm talking about, someone who's kept their own secrets, someone who's made the same choice I did, then I want you to know that you're not alone. I want you to know that there are others out there who understand. There are others who've seen what shouldn't exist and chose to protect rather than expose. There are others carrying the weight of knowledge that the world isn't as simple as we pretend it is. You're not crazy. You're not imagining things. What you saw was real, and your choice to keep it secret was the right choice. If this story reaches someone who thinks I'm lying, or making it up, or exaggerating, then I don't really care. Believe what you want to believe. The truth exists, independent of your belief. The Bigfoot exists in those mountains, whether you believe in it or not. And it's safer because of your disbelief. That's my story. That's what I've carried with me for the better part of a decade, though it's closer to 2 decades now. Every single day, without exception, I think about that ravine. Every time I drive past Joseph on my way to somewhere else, I feel the pull of those mountains. Every fall when the weather starts turning and the leaves change color and the world begins to shift into autumn, I feel the call to go back up there, to see if I can catch another glimpse of the creature. The pull never fades. If anything, it gets stronger as I get older. I'm approaching the age my father was when he died, and I find myself wondering if he spent his last years like I do now, thinking about the creature he'd seen, wondering about its fate, carrying the weight of that knowledge. Every single day, without exception, I think about that ravine. That's the thing that changed my life. A trap, an infection, a decision to stay and help instead of leaving and pretending I never saw it. And in return, I got to know what it was like to touch something that shouldn't exist and find that it was just another living creature trying to survive in a world that's getting smaller and more hostile every year. That's all I have to say about it. That's the story I've been carrying for nearly 20 years now. That's the secret I've kept, the knowledge I've protected, the creature I've believed in when nobody else in the world could. And I'm at peace with that choice. I'm at peace with the silence. I'm at peace with the mystery. If you're reading this and you've had your own encounter, your own moment of seeing something impossible and choosing to keep it secret, then you know what I'm talking about. You know the weight of it. You know the peace of it. You know that you made the right choice, even if nobody will ever believe you, even if you can never tell anyone, even if you carry it alone to your grave. That's all I have to say about it.